Good morning, Reptilians. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Elle, and this is Elle's Reptiles. This week, we are ranking some of the typically considered beginner reptiles from cheapest to most expensive. When I was doing this, I did not sit down and go over every possibility of how much an animal could cost, but just keep in mind that each one of these animals could potentially be as expensive as you wanted them to be. This is also barring the price of the animal because, again, animals can range from, I don't know, $30 to $10,000. But this is just to hopefully give you an idea of basic needs of animals and kind of where they fall cost-wise. Second disclaimer, these animals are not necessarily considered beginner pets because they are beginner friendly. When I'm saying beginner pets, I just mean that these are typically the ones that beginners most often get. Just because it is on this list does not mean necessarily that it is an amazing beginner pet. Before we get started, this video is sponsored by Leopard Gecko, so make sure to stay until the end of the video to find out all about this awesome company. Let's get started. The Crested Gecko. Crested Geckos are so inexpensive to keep. I have never been shy about my absolute adoring of Crested Geckos, but they are also very easy and inexpensive to keep. All they need, bare minimum, is an 18 by 18 by 24 tank, which is relatively inexpensive. They also can do a 29-gallon tank on its side with a conversion kit. That works too. These guys do not require UVB. Many people do put UVB on their tanks just to help them with digestion, things like that, but they do not require UVB. And they also do not typically require heat. In the wintertime, you may need some sort of supplemental heat, but mid to high 70s is comfortable for these guys. And they don't require live bugs. They definitely will be happy being supplemented live bugs, but their staple food source is a powdered food. I spend $20 on a half-pound container of that powdered food for 2 geckos. That lasts me easily 6 months. Usually for one Crested Gecko, you're buying a small little envelope that's $8 and it'll last you a month or two. The most expensive part of their setup is probably just going to be filling it with plants because they do like a lot of coverage, but this can be easily done by buying a large pothos plant or going to Amazon and buying the big packs of leaves and just filling the tank with those and getting some either vines from a local store or sanitizing some driftwood, and you have a setup. Super, super easy. Next up, we have the Leopard Gecko. The Leopard Gecko is another one that I would definitely consider a wonderful beginner reptile. Leopard Geckos are also relatively easy to set up. They require, based on their size, a very bare minimum of a 20-gallon long, although I highly suggest upgrading that to at least a 40-gallon breeder, but these tanks can be found very cheap all the time at Petco's dollar per gallon sales and used on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. They will need a heat source. In the 90 degrees, they are good to go. So a small heat bulb or a heat pad with a thermostat, that is a more pricey option, but it will last you a lot longer. And they do not require UVB, but they are another one that is going to, you're definitely going to see the benefits if you give them a UVB light. These guys do eat live bugs though, and they only eat live bugs. So that means you will have to keep an array of gut-loaded bugs in your house to feed them. And this can be more or less pricey depending on things like if you're breeding them yourself and stuff like that. So something to keep in mind. Anoles. Anoles are, I love anoles. They're always overlooked as just silly pets. I think they're super cool. Anoles are really adorable. They're very active and they are diurnal. These guys require at very bare minimum an 18 by 18 by 24, but really they will use all of the room you give them. So if you want to give them a full 40-gallon tank on its side, you totally can do that and they will use it. They are a diurnal animal, meaning that they will need a heat source, a heat bulb, and they will need UVB lighting to properly digest their food and stuff, so keep that in mind. They also do require ventilation. They do not like stagnant air, so you will, whatever tank you get, make sure that there's proper ventilation going in and out of that tank. Like the Crested Gecko, they require pretty full tanks. They will use all that room. They love to climb, so vines and stuff going up and around the tank. They are also insectivores, meaning, again, a source of gut-loaded insects on hand at all times, but love anoles. Those expenses just tend to add up for them. Next up, we have the fire skink. Fire skinks are fantastic little lizards. They are very active. They require at very least a 40-gallon breeder. They also require burrowing room. These guys love to burrow, so they're gonna need a thick substrate layer. On top of that, they are diurnal, so they are going to need UVB and they need a basking spot as well, a heat source, and they need humidity. So lots of enrichment, obviously, but lots of burrowing room while also keeping the humidity up, while also keeping the tank warm enough, and also having a big enough tank. With just the UVB and the 40-gallon breeder tank alone, those expenses tend to add up very fast, and when you start adding in thick layers of substrate, it starts to stack up. Corn snakes. I feel like it is kind of shocking that corn snakes are this far down the list, but there's a reason for that. Corn snakes are absolutely phenomenal beginner pets. They are wonderful eaters, and they don't ever eat mice or rats that are too big, which makes life so easy, but they do require a heat source. They will greatly benefit from UVB lighting, and they require at least a 4-foot tank. As I have been doing YouTube, this number has gone up. I think when I started, it was about a 40-gallon breeder. Now we're up to at least 4-foot tank. I have mine a 6-foot tank. He uses every inch of the room in there, including climbing all up and down the back wall, just because they will use all of that space that they are given, and I do feel like they need quite a bit of space, and if possible, climbing room and burrowing room. They love to burrow. This guy got moved up to a little bit more expensive on that list. Next up is the ball python. Ball pythons are not, in my opinion, the best beginner reptiles, just because they can be sort of temperamental when it comes to eating, and that is very stressful for new reptile keepers. Other than that, they're fantastic, but they can be a little bit more on the expensive side. So a ball python, bare minimum, is also going to need a 4-foot tank. You want them to be in tanks where they can stretch their bodies out. Mine are both in 6-foot tanks. They use every bit of that room. They stretch out every bit of it. They climb, burrow, they bathe. They use all the room. With them using all the room that is given, with them requiring both a heat source, and again, they will benefit from UVB lighting. And with babies and males preferring climbing room in addition to burrowing room, that is a lot of substrate to fill a 4-foot tank or bigger. Those prices do add up, especially when you take into consideration that they also really need a water bowl that they can get their bodies into, and they are pretty big snakes. That's a lot of room, that's a lot of expenses, and it definitely adds up. Next up, we have the veiled chameleon. I do not think that chameleons are beginner pets. However, every single chain pet store you go into is selling chameleons. You are constantly seeing people with chameleons as their first pet, so that is why it's on this list. Again, going on the record, I do not think chameleons are beginner pets. Cost-wise on this list, as you can see, they are pretty far down because they are expensive. I know I said that we weren't talking about the prices of the animals, but chameleons in general are very pricey. And on top of that, they need a very specific type of tank that allows for a whole bunch of ventilation, and they need humidity, not a crazy amount of humidity, but they do need humidity. And so they do need an automatic misting system, unless you're in there spraying that tank down every so often and making sure they have drinking water. The specialized tank, by the way, has to be for a veiled chameleon at least 4 foot tall by 2 foot by 2 foot. That is very large. You also have to have lots of plants. Chameleons love plants. They especially love live plants. They can also do silk plants. They also have to have branches that are oriented a certain way. If you are trying to feed them out of a bowl, things like mealworms, it is better if they have a specialized dish instead of looking down into a dish where they will get those bugs. Those are pricey. And on top of that, they need a heat source and they need bright UVB lighting as well. So very expensive. Lots of costs that go into keeping a chameleon. And of course, they are insectivores, so they also require a steady stream of gut-loaded bugs. Next up, we have the blue-tongued skink, which should have been before the veiled chameleon. I don't know. But the blue-tongued skink is another one that people absolutely adore, but blue-tongued skinks are very active. They need at least a 4-foot tank. This is another one that has gone up since I very first got Morty several years ago. No matter if you get Indonesian or northern blue-tongued skinks, they have to have burrowing room. They need to have a heat source. They are a diurnal animal, meaning that UVB light is pretty much a must for them. It's going to make them a whole lot more active and a whole lot healthier. Changing out that burrowing room, changing out that substrate regularly in such a large enclosure gets pretty pricey. And they also require a varied diet. They have to have so many things in their diets, whether it's bugs, fresh fruits and veggies, blue-tongue skink diet mixes, occasionally eggs. And like chameleons, these guys are not cheap. They are one of the most expensive animals on this list, especially if you are getting them from a good breeder and you know that they are not wild caught. Wild caught's gonna be super cheap, but those come with a whole other mess of problems. Blue-tongue skinks are super, super cool. Love them so much, but they can be a little bit more on the pricey side. Second to last, we have the bearded dragon. Bearded dragons are everyone's favorite first go-to pet because of their amazing temperament and they're just so sweet, but they are very expensive to get set up. That initial cost is crazy high, and feeding babies cost crazy high. So they need at least a 4-foot tank. They are going to need a pretty powerful heat source, especially as babies. The basking temperature needs to be over 100 degrees. They have to have a lot of UVB lighting. That UVB light needs to span at least 3/4 to the entire length of the tank. That gets very costly very, very quickly. That by itself is what boosts them all the way up to the top of this list, because those lights also need to be replaced depending on the light every 6 months to a year. If you have a female, they will need a dig box as they get older. If you have a bearded dragon that gets sick, bearded dragons are pretty prone to parasites, especially depending on what you're feeding them and things like that. Vet visits. They also, as babies, will eat so many crickets. They can eat anywhere between about 15-20 crickets a day up to like 80 to 100 crickets a day. That gets very costly very, very quickly. And on top of that, they also need a varied diet. So they're going to need lots of different types of gut-loaded bugs in addition to vegetables, fresh vegetables, and occasionally fruits. There's a lot that goes into bearded dragons. There's a lot that goes into making sure that their habitat is set up right. They cost a lot to set up. But luckily, if you have an adult, once they're set up, the cost drastically is reduced. And the last one on the list is the Russian tortoise. Russian tortoises are super cute. Love tortoises, but they require a very large amount of space. Russian tortoises need at least an 8-foot by 4-foot by about 2-foot tall, 2.5-foot tall enclosure. This is a large amount of walking back and forth space. On top of that, they also need the appropriate heating. They need the appropriate UVB lighting. You are probably going to have to build this yourself, which is why they come in the most expensive, because this then goes into what power tools do you have? You need to buy more power tools to build this enclosure. What is the cost of lumber at the moment? Is it going to be very expensive to build? You also are going to have to find a way to fasten those lights on top of the enclosure so that way they are appropriately spaced from your tortoise. They also need substrate in that enclosure. All of those things cost a lot of money. They have to have a steady supply of cuttlebone for calcium and to keep everything trimmed down. They are very expensive to set up. Once they're all set up, they're gonna eat vegetables. It's gonna be super easy to take care of them. It's just setting them up that is the pricey part. But yeah, that is it. That is all that I have for this week's video. Hopefully, if you were wondering cost-wise what sorts of animals would be best for you, hopefully this helped. As I said at the beginning, you can put as much money into these guys as you want. The more money and things that you get for them, the happier they will be. Hopefully this helped anyway. As I said at the beginning of this video is sponsored by Leopard Geckos. Leopard Geckos is such a cool company that allows you to take those super cheap tanks that you may have found or that you may have had laying around and turn them into front opening tanks for things like geckos or frogs or tarantulas or whatever. You can do that. Super, super cool. They are very inexpensive and they are very easy to install. Takes a couple of minutes. I absolutely adore the conversion kits that I have gotten from Leopard Geckos. They're wonderful. If you happen to order from them, make sure to leave Elle's Reptiles in the How Did You Hear About Us box. That way they know that you guys are coming from here. Thank you so much to Leopard Geckos for continuing to sponsor these videos. If you haven't already, please feel free to follow me on my other socials and like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications every single time I put out a new video, which is every Sunday and some Wednesdays. This week's Instagram shout out is here, and this week's subscribe shout out is here. Thank you so much for liking and following, subscribing, and commenting and sharing, and all that jazz. You are the bee's knees. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye. Okay. Like, stay sat up. Just sit up, me. They are a nocturnal animal. And of course, And of course, they... Mine...
Oh, I'm so sorry.
There's something in my eye.